Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Inner Loops YouTube channel. I'm Kira, and today, as part of our Author's Corner series, I'll be having a conversation with Adam Schwartz about his new collection of fiction, The Rest of the World. For more Adam and more Author's Corner, you can check out our website to find articles, interviews, podcasts, episodes, and most importantly, a link to purchase the book. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, of course. I love your credibility bookshelf. Courtney is very big on credibility bookshelves in the backgrounds of Zooms.
I mean, it's everything.
It is. It is. I have nothing here, so you're out bookshelfing me.
Now, you
Um,
have good background too.
thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. So I'd love to start by talking about how the collection came together. I was looking through where each story had been individually published before, and the earliest was back in, it looks like 1997, and the most recent just last winter. How did these stories find each other? How did they come together as a collection?
Yeah, so the first story was published way back in 1997. That definitely seems like a long time ago now. If you asked me back then if I thought it was going to take me, another 20 years or something to finish the collection, or 20 something years, I would have said, no, it's not going to take me that long. But it did. It took me that long to finish the collection. Along the way, I wrote some other work that didn't fit thematically in the book. And then, of course, I had episodes where I kind of absorbed myself in writing projects that didn't work out. So those things ate up time. And then I'm just kind of a turtlishly slow writer. I just have a really plodding pace to getting the work done. So yeah, so it took me a long time to get enough stories together that are thematically unified to make a collection. But at some point when you first start teaching, when I first started teaching in Baltimore, way back then in the late 90s, at first you're just sort of struck by the array of problems that so many kids are having to navigate, children are having to navigate. And, so I had some years where I was just kind of digesting this experience of kind of being in the same space with kids who had sometimes just sort of catastrophic things going on
Yeah.
in their lives outside of school. And, after some years of kind of being immersed in this environment at school, in as much as one can be immersed in it in a school building. I began thinking about how to make stories out of these experiences that I was either exposed to through the kids, or sometimes invited to to at least talk about with the kids. So yeah.
Yeah, that actually leads us into my next question. I know Kevin McAvoy described the book as a portrait gallery of young people. Many of your protagonists and secondary characters are teens or young adults navigating circumstances that feel very unique to that particular time in your life, like placelessness and uncertainty. I was going to ask why you're drawn to these kinds of characters, but I feel like the answer is obvious. And I'm really curious to know how your time as a high school's teacher influenced your work, and maybe also how it kind of bridged the gap from maybe MFA thesis to now. Like, are any of these from your MFA time? Like, how did your work as a teacher kind of help develop those ideas they were interested in then?
Yeah. So, um, a classroom is kind of it's kind of a weird space insofar as, probably if I wasn't a teacher, there would be the kind of usual familiar barriers between me and getting to know the kinds of students in my classroom. And so by this, I just mean, barriers around race and barriers around class, which, um, divides so much of our country. And a classroom is sort of a strange place because it ends up just kind of naturally melting these barriers away. Um, and so it's kind of a unique environment in which I've been able to get to know a lot of young people um, that I otherwise wouldn't have gotten to know, and um, to understand just in some cases sort of come to understand the world through their eyes, and how they see the world and the kinds of experiences they have to sometimes deal with. So in that way, being a teacher has exposed me to the kinds of challenges a lot of kids in Baltimore go through. And I want to make sure, I like to make sure I don't want to pretend like I'm, although I write about young people coming of age in Baltimore, I haven't dealt with these experiences firsthand. I sort of come to understand them secondhand by getting to know the students. But I
Mhm.
wouldn't have that experience if I wasn't a school teacher, probably.
Yeah, were you interested in writing younger protagonists before you became a teacher as well? Has it always been an interest of yours, or was that really something that came in after you started working with people that age?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think I've always been sort of interested in this time in people's lives, this transition, of course, we all go through in adolescence, where we move from being children to adults. And um, I am interested in this time where we all, to varying degrees, sort of part with our innocence, and
Mhm.
that experience is like. Um, and for young people in Baltimore, they are sometimes made to part with their innocence really early, um, and um, are sometimes exposed to the hardness of the world and the hardness of the adult world when they're really young. Um, and um, I guess I guess my real interest in that um, developed once I was a school teacher in Baltimore.
Mhm.
I think I've always been generally interested in adolescence and how people make this transition. Um, uh, but it became a focus of my writing once I became a school teacher.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I agree with you. I always think that, like, teenage girls are the most viciously interesting people on the planet. I could read infinite numbers of short stories about teenage girls.
Right. It's such a strange time in our lives where um, um, we're just trying to figure out like who we are and how we're going to make our way in the world, and um, the way we want to be in the world, and what our values are going to be, and the kind of people we want to be. And those are all hard decisions and really big decisions. And um, all that takes place is, our identities are being forged during those years. Uh,
Yeah.
so um, I know for young men in particular, I was especially boneheaded and kind of impulsive as a teen and young adult. So, and it can also be a really volatile time in people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Have
Yeah.
you ever had a conversation with a student, maybe like a past student, about your fiction? Have they come up to you and been like, "Oh, Mr. Schwartz, this is about me?"
Uh, no, I tend not to talk very much about my writing at school. Uh,
Yeah.
I sort of feel like I don't know, when I'm at school, like it's sort of about the kids and not about me and my writing. Um, um, Occasionally, I share with students I'm a writer. I mean, the students know I'm a writer. I feel it's important they should know that I'm a writer because it's like I'm nattering on all day about like homeless places and organizing our essays. And so I feel like by sharing with them that I'm a writer and some of my experiences when, I'm writing and struggles when I'm writing, it's sort of like saying, I'm not just talking about this because it's my job, but it's important to me. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense. And to keep the world separate.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about how the two, I feel like the two things that really connect most of the stories in the collection are that they're about young people, they're growing up in Baltimore, as we've discussed. And I went to Hopkins for undergrad, so I spent 4 years in
Oh,
Baltimore. And
nice.
it was so charming to come up against all of these landmarks, like really specific things, Inner Harbor, streets, monuments. But then even like, I think there's like a Foot Locker that comes up multiple times for the characters. And I'm like, this
Right,
feels so like, ooh, tangible.
right.
And I'm always interested in authors who anchor their stories in very particular places. How
Mhm.
do you see your work in conversation with the city? Or how do you see each story maybe in conversation with the others, especially because you've written them over such a long period of time?
Yeah. Um, so, I think like a lot of our country, there's two Americas. Um, um, there and in our two Americas, there are people who are affluent and there are people who are struggling. And the same is really true of Baltimore. It feels like there's two Baltimores. And there are these really thriving neighborhoods around the water, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Canton and Federal Hill and the Inner Harbor, um, and Fells Point. Um, and that's one Baltimore. And then there are just vast stretches of the city that are really struggling. My school recently relocated to Harlem Park, a neighborhood in West Baltimore, and um, the I say this as somebody who lived in the city for over a decade, and I'm now in year 24 of teaching high school in Baltimore. Um, the depth of poverty over there in West Baltimore is staggering, and there are just blocks and blocks and blocks where there's on more vacants on the home on the blocks than there are occupied homes.
Hmm.
That goes on for miles in some directions. Um, so, um, I'm interested um, in how students navigate this world, and um, the challenges it presents for them. And that's a lot of Baltimore too. Um, I'm sure there's people who only sort of think of Baltimore as those sort of trendier neighborhoods that just ticked off around the water. There are probably people who only see Baltimore as those places and don't give a lot of thought um, to these vast other stretches of Baltimore where there are lots of different communities that are there. But that's the struggling communities are a really big part of Baltimore too. Um, and one thing I would also say is that when we think of these struggling communities, like the neighborhood where my school is in Harlem Park, um, a lot of people tend to sort of pathologize them or problematize them. The local news has a fetish for reporting crime that often takes place in communities like where my school is. But what I've seen over the years is, a lot of these communities and the people who live there um, hang together and support one another um, a lot more than sort of the local news gives them credit for, and a lot more than people who just might be driving through that neighborhood give them credit for. And um, I try and capture some of that in my work too. Um, Yeah.
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 Yeah, and you write nonfiction as well, notably for the Baltimore Sun. So I think you have an interesting perspective as someone who's both a part of maybe that media cycle about portraying the neighborhoods in Baltimore from like a nonfictional standpoint, but then also from a fictional standpoint. And I'm curious about how you think about the different kinds of chronicling that those genres call for, the different kinds of flexibilities that you have as a writer to present those kinds of stories. Where do you feel that your work as a nonfiction writer and as a fiction writer overlap or divide?
Um, yeah. So, I mean, most of those op-eds, I'm sort of writing nonfiction, of course, again, about my experience of coming to know young people in Baltimore. Um, um, sometimes in my nonfiction, I think both my nonfiction and my fiction, I'm trying to humanize these figures that I feel sometimes um, are, as I said, sort of pathologized by the local news, uh,
Mhm.
or or by people who don't know the communities. Um, and so I think in both forms, I'm trying to um, uh, I'm trying to reveal some of the complexities of these places. Years ago, if you'd asked me, um, I don't know, even as recently as like 10 years ago, if you'd asked me like, well, what kind of writing you're interested in, I'd say, well, I'm only interested in writing stories. And, um, I've always felt there's something really unique about the short story form, and it's kind of organic and kind of a reflection of how we live and organize experience, et cetera. And I don't want to write nonfiction, and my pace isn't really, my kind of internal clock for writing isn't suited to a novel. I'm just really drawn to stories. And then at some point, I don't know, I started like, I wrote one op-ed for the Sun, and then almost like sort of against my own will, I began like kind of unpacking the form of like the op-ed, and like, how they're organized. Um, and so now, even when I don't want to, I end up sort of like, you know, kind of fitting insights into an op-ed form, and, playing around with that. So um, it's it's a somewhat recent development in my writing these op-eds, and something that's actually surprised me, that I started writing them, and after years swearing I wasn't interested in writing fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's interesting to hear you talk about pace as well, because something I really admire about your work is each story moves. Like when I'm writing, I feel like I sometimes get stuck in places, stuck in settings, like stuck in conversations. But in your dialogue, especially, there's a real efficiency. Like we move through these scenes, we're getting through the plot. And I feel like again, that is kind of unique to the short story genre,
Mhm.
where that kind of like really brisk movement, although obviously possible in a novel, isn't always maybe at the forefront. So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about narrative speed and how you think about like the structure of the short story.
Yeah. So when I was at Swanee Writers Conference a couple of years ago, I met a writer in my workshop who's great. Um, his name is William, and I'm spacing out his last name now. But I'll I'll get it to you. um, and anyway, he had come out of the um, writing program at Iowa, and so one of his instructors at Iowa had talked about a thing I'd never heard before, and this writer William at Swanee called it scene hygiene. Um, hygiene, and so there were a couple different ingredients, and when scenes have good hygiene, there are a couple different ingredients they have, and so um, one of them is entering the scene as late as possible. Uh,
Hmm.
and so this writer at Swanee, he was complimenting my work and saying that I had good scene hygiene, in part because I entered the scene, or I brought the reader into the scene as late as possible. Um, and of course, that has to do with pace, and it's something I hadn't realized about my work until he pointed it out. But I think I do try and do that. I think I do try and enter the scene, have the reader enter the scene as late as possible, so that things are already sort of motoring and percolating. And, in general, I'm just terribly, terribly afraid of boring the reader, um, and losing the reader and having the reader lose interest. I'm terribly
Mhm.
afraid of these things. Um, and so, I think my narrative style and my pacing, um, developed out of this sort of interest in keeping the reader involved and absorbed. And um, I know how I feel. Like, if you start reading a story and you're just drowning in like these over contextualized details before the thing even gets going. And so um, it's the kind of thing I'm trying to avoid. And I want things to happen, um, and I want the story um, to have motive force and to carry the reader along.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love that, entering the scene as late as possible. And how
Yeah,
he was immediately like, "Oh, you're such a hygienic writer. Your scenes are such good hygiene." I love that.
right. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, so actually, we're coming up to time. My final question for you is that for our Authors Corner project, we're promoting authors primarily who have worked with small indie presses. Could you talk us through your publication process and how, this got from the page to being bound?
Yeah. The people at Washington Writers Publishing House have been great when the book won the prize. It's the press actually is a cooperative where winning writers agree to sort of stay on and pitch in for 2 years after their book wins. And so it creates a real kind of tight-knit community of writers at the press, and everybody there has been great. They've been professional and sharp and kind. And so after the book won, they several people at the press helped with suggesting possible edits. Some of those were line edits, some were ideas about story order. So, that was great to, have this kind of feedback from other writers. Um, and there's a modest budget for a cover designer, and a modest budget for a copywriter, proofreader, and for the graphic designer that will do the layout. And so people at the press, offer referrals um, to people that will do that work to bring the book to life. And so you can pick and choose who you want. One of the really cool things about having the Washington Writers Publishing House publish the book is that the winning writer gets sort of a lot of say about how it's going to look and shaping its physical appearance and the layout and choosing the font and the cover. And so I think that's somewhat unique in the publishing world. So that was really cool. It's been a great experience.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, that's so great to hear.
Yeah.
And if you feel comfortable sharing, so you submitted and it won the prize. How many ti or how long did you spend sending out the manuscript or like sending out the book before that happened?
Yeah. Um, so I was sending the book out for probably 2 years before that. I had a couple close calls. It was a finalist. in the Orison book contest, judged by Victor Laval. And, so I had a number of months where I was checking my email every 5 minutes and was reading Victor Laval's books and thinking, this guy is going to come through for me. But it didn't win. It was a finalist. I had a couple agents who were, interested in the book and, read the whole thing and gave me some feedback on the book, but in the end, didn't want to take it on.
Mhm.
So I had a couple close calls, sending the book out. I had lots of other contests just brush me off, or other agents just brush me off. But eventually I lucked out, and it won this Washington Writers Publishing House contest. So I've been grateful.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, congratulations again.
Thank you.
And I would love it if you could tell the people watching where they could find you or where they could find the book. So I know, disclaimer, that you're taking a social media break. Maybe like your website or anywhere else that you would like people to be able to find you.
For sure. Um, yeah, so my website is www.adamschwartzwriter.org. And it can also be purchased by going to the Washington Writers Publishing House website.
Okay, perfect. And you can find us, The Inner Loop, here on the Inner Loop YouTube channel, on our website, theinnerlooplit.org, on Facebook at The Inner Loop, and on Twitter and Instagram at The Inner Loop Lit. Thank you so much, Adam, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for talking with me today. It's been great.
Yeah. Okay, bye, everybody.
Okay.
Okay, and I'll end the recording.
Over.
Yes.